you're in a meeting. The team's been running experiments for months. Everyone's got their tracking set up. You're looking at the dashboard. It's empty. No runs, no metrics, just silence. Someone says, "We need to check MLflow.set tracking URI." And you're like, "What?" We did that. You open the file and it's pointing to a directory on your laptop. That's not where the server is. That's the problem. It's not the code. It's not the model. It's the tracking URI. This is Marketing Science, the show about marketing science fundamentals for data-driven marketers. I'm Mikey, and today we're talking about MLflow Tracking URI setup and error resolution, the one that makes or breaks your experiment visibility. Here's what happens. You're setting up a project with MLflow. You write the code to log metrics. Then you set your tracking URI, usually like this, MLflow.set tracking URI. And if everything's local, it works fine. But when you're using a remote server or some kind of cloud service, that URI changes. It might be a port like 501.neetcec.vertex, or it could be something like a file-based tracking URI, like MLflow.ctrackingURI file, not ce.cmelruns. And that's where it goes sideways. You set your local tracking URI and push code to a remote server or cluster, and then the experiment never shows up. The run isn't logged. Your metrics are in thin air. You're looking at a screen like it's broken, but it's not. It's just pointing to the wrong place. The MLflow Tracking URI is where MLflow sends all its data. Without the right one, you're logging in the dark. That's not just frustrating. It costs time, money, and credibility, because you're running experiments that aren't being captured. You don't get your baseline, you don't see how models compare, and you can't even tell if your code is working. It's like trying to build a house with no foundation. And this isn't just a gotcha. This is a real-world production-level issue that comes up every time you go from local development to deployment. You're not supposed to be debugging URI errors in the middle of a sprint. That's why we have to get it right on day one. Let's walk through how to do it properly. First, determine your environment. Are you working locally on a notebook server, in a cloud cluster? You'll need to know if you're using file-based tracking or HTTP tracking. For local development, this is fine. MLflow.set tracking URI file, 1cml runs. But for anything else, it's not. If you're in a remote environment like on Vertex AI or some managed ML platform, the URI needs to point directly to that server, like MLflow.set tracking URI. You have to use the actual URL from your setup. Then, check if you're using an MLflow registry. If so, it's not just about tracking. It's also setting the registry URI, something like MLflow.set registry URI. That's a separate one. You've got to be careful with file paths too. If you set it to a local directory, and then you run your script on a remote server that doesn't have access to that path, nothing gets logged. So always test your setup in the same environment where it'll run. Next comes permissions. This is one of the sneaky ones. When you're using Vertex AI or something like that, there are permission errors coming from billing accounts, project IDs, and sometimes even missing extensions. The error might not be clear. It says something about ZCP or GCP project ID mismatches, but if you dig into those, you'll find it's tied to how MLflow connects. If your server is behind a firewall or using HTTPS, make sure the URI has the right protocol in front of it. That simple mistake can waste an hour or more. Also, be mindful of where your model registry is. If you're using MLflow on your local machine and pushing models to a remote registry, you have to set both tracking and registry URIs separately. Don't assume they're the same. You'll also want to make sure that the server you're pointing to is actually running. Try pinging it or hitting the endpoint directly. If you get a timeout, your URI is wrong or it's unreachable. And finally, don't overlook the logging setup. If you're logging to a file and you set MLflow.set tracking URI file less MLLR runs, but then try to pull metrics from a cluster that doesn't have access to that path, you'll miss everything. Always make sure the URI and the access match. Here's the one number you actually need to remember. When you set up tracking, use the exact URI from your server or cloud provider configuration, not just a guess. Don't trust local logs alone. Make sure it works in the environment where it'll run. If things don't show up, start with the URI. That's where everything begins and ends. Now here's what goes wrong when people skip the details. Most people don't realize that tracking URIs are tied to execution environments. If you set your URI in a notebook, but then run code on a cluster, it won't work. You have to ensure that every script you run, whether it's a Python job or a training pipeline, has access to the right tracking path. Another common mistake is confusing the tracking URI with the registry URI. These are two different systems. One logs the experiment data. The other stores models and versions. If you set one but not the other, you might think everything's fine, but your model versioning isn't working. Then there are permissions. If you're using a managed ML platform like Vertex AI, it's easy to get lost in billing or project ID errors. A misconfigured ZCP or an incorrect GCP extension can prevent MLflow from connecting at all. Also, people tend to ignore timeouts or error messages that look like they're unrelated. They're not unrelated. If your server isn't running, or if you try to log to a URI that requires authentication and doesn't have it, you'll see nothing. That's how you lose hours. And if you're using local tracking in a production environment, that's the biggest trap. Local tracking is great for testing, but it doesn't scale. Once you deploy to servers, your URI must point to something remote. If not, your logs are just sitting on your desktop, and that's a silent failure. Finally, there's the alert issue. If you're using MLflow in production and you set thresholds too tight, your model registry or experiment logs will fire alerts every time it refreshes. It's like setting off a fire alarm for every breath. That's a problem, not a solution. There's also a whole other dimension to this that gets missed. When teams move from development to staging to production, they often forget that the tracking URI can have different configurations per environment. You might have one working in dev but failing in prod because the paths are set up differently or because of network restrictions you didn't consider. That's why it's essential to make sure all environments are configured consistently. And let's talk about the registry. A lot of people treat tracking and registry as the same thing, but they're not. Tracking logs where your experiments run and what metrics come out of them. Registry handles storing the actual models themselves. If you're using MLflow in an enterprise setting, especially one that uses version control for models, then both have to be set up correctly or you'll have half the story. Also, some platforms like Vertex AI will auto-generate tracking URIs when you create a new experiment, but those can easily get lost if you don't copy them correctly. It's not always obvious how or where they live until something breaks down. One particularly hard one is when you deploy a model to production and then want to monitor how it performs, especially in the case of model drift. If your tracking URI wasn't set up right originally, there's no way for you to trace back how that model behaved during training versus testing. So even after the model is live, you're flying blind. The last thing that trips people up is environment variables. It's easy to write code that works perfectly on one machine, but fails completely when deployed in a CI or CD pipeline because it's trying to reference a URI that doesn't exist in that context. Environment management is crucial here. You should always be explicit about what each script needs to connect and not rely on defaults or hard-coded assumptions. Even if you're just starting out, don't let the setup phase be an afterthought. Spend time making sure it's robust enough for real-world use, not just a demo. You'll save yourself headaches later, especially when dealing with large teams or cross-functional projects where multiple people are working off the same experiment. You know what? It might seem small. But this issue of the tracking URI, getting it wrong, is one of those things that makes or breaks the entire data flow in your ML project. It's not a feature, it's infrastructure. And if you're not careful, you'll find yourself spending hours trying to figure out why nothing shows up. This is marketing science. If you're logging experiments without knowing the right URI, your data is useless. Set it correctly from the start, and everything else flows from there. Do that one thing before you do anything else in your experiment tracking. That's it. If this one saved you an hour or more, the full system's inside the course at learn.mikey.ai. I'm Mikey. Go get your tracking right.